All right. All right, everybody. Welcome to today's lesson. Today we are going to be covering topic 1.2 in AP World History Modern, which is titled Developments in Dar al Islam from 1200 to 1450. So, basically speaking, what we're going to be doing is covering sort of the Islamic world in this time period right here. So, we'll get started in just a second. So I'm Mr. Terry. Thanks for joining us today. If you are in the live chat, good to see you today. If you're watching this in the future, then hello from the past. This course and this is designed specifically around the objectives and the core from AP World History Modern. So that's what we're going along with. A few things for interaction if you are in the live stream. You can, if you have questions or comments, for those to be kind of read and seen, you can do that in a couple ways. If you have a comment or specifically a comment or a question from that from the lesson, you may use the super chat function here on YouTube. Those allow you to type a message and or a question, and those can be and those will be seen by me, and I'll go after those or read those after the lesson has started. A couple other ways that you can support this channel, although the content of this channel is provided at no charge. Donations and pledges are extremely appreciated if you feel so inclined. A couple ways you can do that. One is through the super chat function, which again, to do that, you'll see under the YouTube chat, you'll see a $sign. If you'd like to participate with that, you can donate that way. Another way you can donate is through Streamlabs. There should be a link in the description below, and also through Patreon. There's a Patreon account. You can go there and make a pledge, and those things very much support this stream and what we're trying to do here. Okay, with that, I think we'll go ahead and just about get ready to get started here. So, grab your notebooks, whatever you need, or if you're just hanging out, awesome. Glad to have you here today. All right, then. So, like I said before, what we are covering here today is basically the Islamic world in this time period here. So, a couple things you're not going to necessarily get is a history of the origination of Islam with the Prophet Muhammad. We're going to talk about some of how the policies have interacted this time period, because we're starting roughly in 1200, which means that the life of Muhammad and kind of his works and his actions were in the early to mid 7th century. So it's been quite a while since then. So things have changed quite a bit, and so that's what we're going to be looking at here today. So let's go ahead and check it out and get started. Okay. All right. So, learning objectives that are found in this lesson. These are the things that we want to be able to do, or have an idea of these things, which are going to be very important to know, especially if you are a student for AP World History, because these are the things that College Board wants you to know. So, hopefully today, these are some of the things we're going to look at. So, Objective 1D, explain how systems of belief and their practices affected society in the period from 1200 to 1450. We'll be doing that. And then explain the causes and effects of the rise of Islamic states over time. So we'll talk about some of the Islamic states. And then we'll also, for the final one here, explain the effects of intellectual innovation in Dar es Salaam, or sort of the world of Islam. All right, let's kind of set the stage up. Let's just super briefly just see what kind of has been going on the eve of what we're talking about here. Three major religions, the three major monotheistic religions are influencing a lot of parts of the world. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are continuing, right, to influence Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. So those are three dominant things. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the connections, I guess, somewhat of the connections between the religions, because there is some interconnectivity there. Now, Islam spread and had been spreading ever since the 7th century with the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And at its height, kind of up to the kind of where the time period we were talking about, Islam has spread very much so all the way in the east from India and west all the way to Spain. So that is a vast, vast region there with a lot of diversity. And one of the things you're going to find out is some of the diversity of the peoples of Islam also had kept it up to this point from being really a unified like Islamic empire, although attempted, especially early on, kind of fragments, and you'll see a little bit about that today. All right, some other things that there has been some advancements in sort of the Islamic world. A couple specifically up to this time period are advances in algebra and mathematics, as well as medicine, between the 8th and 13th centuries, especially under the Abbasid Caliphate, which has been a major force at this time. Also, the Islamic world has also served in a way as a house of learning and educational achievements. Specifically, the city of Baghdad had up to this point become really a major, major center of that, with the Baghdad House of Wisdom. And then the interaction between a lot of people, it varies, but in Spain, one of the intellectual sort of capitals of the world at this time, where you had very much a strong mix of Christians and Muslims as well as Jews, but Christians and Muslims cooperated quite well in Spain. So you see this happening as well. So you do see some high amounts of tolerance at this time. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and get going. So again, like I was saying, we're right now kind of in an age and bringing an age where so much wisdom, right, and so much knowledge of different types of educational matters are really being consolidated and studied heavily amongst Muslim scholars. The Baghdad House of Wisdom was one of those places. And one of the reasons for that, too, is the central location of the Islamic world, especially around the Middle East, is connecting the different educational achievements that are coming from different corners of the world and kind of being brought into here. So that is something to think about as we are getting started here. Okay, so our time period begins really with the end of an empire, which was the Abbasid Empire. And starting in the 1100s and 1200s, one of the specific blows to the Abbasid Empire was the invasions and sort of military conflicts with specifically four different groups. And we're just going to mention them a little bit because those are the groups that in the time period we're going to be talking here are really kind of the big influences. Okay, so over in Egypt, we had the development of what's eventually going to be called the Mamluk Sultanate. And what was going on in Egypt was there was the recruitment of slaves, or these Mamluks. And the Mamluks were mostly Turkish, so they came from much more east of Egypt. And these people, though, were not just recruited as like in the typical sense of laborers and things like that. Eventually, some of them are going to serve in the military. They're going to serve in the government. And over time, they seized control actually from Egypt, or control of Egypt and North Africa, which Abbasid Empire had invested sort of interests in. So you're seeing some of this is in a way almost like an internal breaking up, as you're going to see here. So that's one group that we got here that's coming in, but we've got a picture over there of a Mamluk. You can see a Mamluk military figure. All right, let's move over to another group, the Seljuk Turks. So the Seljuk Turks originated in Central Asia. I'll show you guys a map here in just a moment here. But they originated in Central Asia. What you see as Turkey today is actually not where the Turks originated. But again, I will show you there. So they captured parts of the Middle East as they became stronger and stronger, including the city of Baghdad, which, of course, in this time is quite an achievement and quite a possession to be able to have here. Now, another kind of thing that happens in here also is the leader of the Seljuk will call himself a sultan. A sultan is kind of like an Islamic king, and the Seljuk Turks had eventually kind of converted into Islam. So one of the big things that sort of happens here, one of the big developments here, is a kind of change of the position of caliph. The caliph was somebody that was both kind of leader of sort of the empire and leader of like a political leader, as well as a religious authority, right? They were kind of the highest ranking person here. And what ends up kind of happening here is when the sultan will come in, and although, he is Islamic, and they are Islamic, they will take political power. Now, you will still have kind of the Abbasid caliph over time, but that person is going to be more solely as a religious authority, specifically a Sunni religious authority. Now, one of the other big features of the Seljuk Turks was their constant clash with the Byzantine Empire. This is going to be a long part of their history, which with it also kind of peaking in the Crusades, as we're going to kind of mention in passing here. But they actually took a lot of territory from the Byzantine Empire in the Middle East. So the Seljuk, specifically the Seljuk Empire, lasted from about 1037 to 1194. So you can see some of the photos or images up here. And you see the customary hat, and then down here you got a little scene with clashing with the Byzantine Empire. Okay, the other group that we're talking about here that is coming through is the Crusaders, Christians from the West. So they are also starting to move in, and at certain times, some successful more than others. Many, of course, were not. But nevertheless, the interaction with the Crusaders is a major, major thing. So just to briefly explain, during the Abbasid Empire, so really for centuries, Christians had been allowed to travel into the sites in and around Jerusalem, which were a holy land to Christians and Christian history, as well as Islamic history, but they were allowed. In fact, the Abbasid Empire would make a lot of money from these travelers coming in, and so it was something worth preserving at that time. However, when the Seljuk Turks took over this region, they attempted to limit more of that travel, and there was some hostility towards pilgrims around that route. And it was because of this that you get the origination of the Crusades, basically an attempt by European Christians to sort of reopen access to this territory here. And that is going to be the Crusades. We're going to talk about the Crusades will be more for another time, not specifically in this lesson, but that is a little bit of the background there. So Crusaders, that is our third group of groups coming into the Abbasid Empire. And then the last one we're going to talk about is the Mongols. Now, there is a lot more attention paid to the Mongols in future topics, so this is just going to be quite brief with this. Now, they, like the Turks, also originated in Central Asia, okay, a little bit further east and north of them, and they officially basically conquered what was left of the Abbasid Empire. They drove the Turks out of Baghdad. They basically annihilated Baghdad in one of the bloodiest, later on, in 1258, one of the largest, highest casualty probably battles that you see in the kind of and early modern world. So the Mongols actually went much further west and were basically stopped in Egypt by the Mamluks. So their quest to conquer to the west was stopped in Egypt. So that is where they will stop right there. So those are, again, your four groups that are now kind of bringing the fall of the Abbasid Empire, which was kind of the big sort of Islamic group at this time and in this region. So just to recap real quick who they were, you got the Mamluks over there around Egypt, Seljuk Turks coming in from Central Asia, you got Christian Crusaders coming from the west, and then Mongols also coming from the east. But yes, the Siege of Baghdad is one of the highest casualty battles and defeats in history. Interestingly, the casualty rate actually varies quite a bit depending on what sources you are looking through. For example, Western sources often put the casualties, we're talking civilian casualties here, by the way, anywhere from 200,000 to 800,000, which right away is extremely difficult, especially in an era before some of the weapons of if you want to call it mass destruction for this era, but nevertheless. However, Arab sources actually differ quite a lot because some Arab sources can put it nearly at 2 million casualties. So wherever the sources are most reliable, there you got more of an insider source and an outsider source, but nevertheless, high casualties with the Mongol sieges and fighting off of the empire here. Okay, so when we were talking about a little bit of geography here, some things we were looking at, the Turks specifically is wanted to show you. See that little, if you can see my mouse, that little purple area right there? That is the original homeland of the Turks. So they're going to be moving west, south, and west into the Abbasid Empire coming over here. We got the Byzantine Empire over here, which is totally a shell of its former self, as at its peak had controlled everything. Basically the east side of the Mediterranean, but that is not so much the case anymore. But the Abbasid Empire was once again as controlling as basically all North Africa, throughout the Middle East, and into Central Asia, but that's not happening as much. A group we're going to be discussing later on is the Islamic group that moves into northern India. They're called the Delhi Sultanate, but we'll be talking about them later. Okay. All right, let's talk about kind of the effects of the invasions and also the trade shifts that happened as a result of that. So the Abbasids, and usually just, again, maybe we should go back to the map again. Remember, this region right here of the Middle East is at the crossroads of world trade. Everything coming out of South Asia, East Asia, Europe, and North Africa, those trade routes basically all converge here. So trade was really the name of the economic game here. And there are some challenges, though, start to happen. The worst thing that can happen to trade routes is instability from invasions. Traders don't want to go into war zones, so they'll avoid them or cut them off altogether. So with kind of those challenges that had preceded the last about 100 or so years, are really affecting trade. So things that used to be traded through Baghdad on what would be called like the South Silk Road started to shift up north. So let me show you once again. Baghdad right here was there was a southern Silk Road, right? So there was a northern Silk Road that went north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. Again, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the north of the Caspian and Black Sea. But then there was also one that went south, and that went right through Baghdad. And so what was happening here is during these tough times, trade was going north of the Abbasid Empire rather than straight through. So that was a huge loss of revenue there. Now, the city of Baghdad, too, because of its massive amounts of destruction, lost its population, meaning the infrastructure for those trade routes and those sort of things fell into disrepair. So canals, roads, and things like that. It's going to be a lot more banditry as well. So their infrastructure started to fade as well as that. And also the countryside, because of a lot of the warfare and a lot of the lack of infrastructural keep up, agricultural needs really, really went out of hand, and they were unable to sustain their urban populations because agriculture had always done very well here in Middle East and Central Asia, like Iran, places like that area. And because of that, they couldn't meet up with those needs. So that's going to be a challenge for the populations. Okay, well, let's move on to cultural and social life real quick. So the Islamic world became very fragmented, okay, politically. But that did not necessarily hurt their advancement as with culture. So, for example, there were some very important and universities throughout sort of the Islamic world, specifically Baghdad. We talk about Baghdad, House of Wisdom. Over in West in Cordoba, which really becomes kind of like the capital for Islamic Spain. Then you got Cairo in Egypt and Bukhara out in Central Asia. So these are places where the highest amounts of education and learning are actually happening here. Now, as far as cultural continuities going on, some things that are very important to keep in mind. One is that Islamic scholars were the ones that were preserving and translating a lot of the ancient Greek, Roman information there. So like Greek literary classics. They were, while Europe was going through sort of the Middle Ages and some of kind of the appreciation a little bit of some of those Greek classics as they kind of dwindled a bit. And it was actually in the Islamic world that those scholars were the ones that were preserving those things and studying them, continuing to study them. In fact, they were even translated to Arabic, so they were much more highly read. Another thing that's happening here is the mathematics. Now, the mathematics, really capital of the world in this time period, was really coming out of India. They were the ones, algebraic, foundations and other mathematical things. Those texts were coming in from India, where they would be studied and distributed as well. Also, some other technological and cultural things, paper making. If you had joined us for lesson 1.1, we talked a little bit about paper making coming out of China. That was now coming across the technology and things like that coming across the Silk Road. And paper making, of course, made it possible to be able to preserve so many of these mathematical and literary traditions. So there you go. Those are very important continuities that they are keeping up and are largely responsible for their spread. All right, some more cultural social life. There were some specific, individuals also involved in that, and kind of like what you're going to find later on in the European Renaissance are these some of these people that are very well versed and very well studied in multiple subjects. Right, you've heard about like a Renaissance man, and this is of course happening right here. So Nasser al-Din al-Tusi, he had major contributions in a bunch of different things, for example. So, for example, astronomy, law, logic, ethics, mathematics, philosophy, medicine. These were things that were really put forward. And in fact, a couple of the examples of some of his achievements was he built one of the best observatories in the world at this time that provided the most accurate astronomical charts that we have ever had. Up to this point in history. Also, he is credited basically towards laying the groundwork for trigonometry. So those are two big innovations happening here. Also, in general, too, you saw just kind of broad advancements in medical, right, in the sort of the medical field. Also in hospital care, which was improving in cities. So major advances happening there as well. A little more cultural and social life. A couple other contributors to be mindful of. Ibn Khaldun, he was known for his historical accounts. He was, very well known for that. Historical accounts. In fact, a lot of people consider him the father of historiography, which is basically the study of studying history and the methods used. And sociology as well is kind of seen as the father of what we consider sociology as well. He was very well studied also later on by Europeans, so he became very famous. His work's very famous over there too. Also, there is instances of prolific female writers. Aisha al-Ba'uniyya, she was probably the most prolific female Muslim writer before the 20th century. Now, one of the reasons for that is a lot of women some of their works weren't well distributed or really as well appreciated in those days. So hers are very religiously founded. Her works describe a lot of her path towards illumination, so kind of a spiritual life there. Reflect a lot of Sufi traditions. We're going to talk about Sufis here, which is much more of a kind of branch of Islam that focuses more on inner reflection, right, towards understanding truths rather than some of the rigid, scriptural sort of studies with the Quran. Okay, but now for Sufis. So you have remember the two major groups in Islam are Sunni and Shia. Sunni today make up by far the majority of Muslims. Sufis and then Shia Muslims making up another percentage. Sufis a little bit smaller, but had a huge role in the spread of Islam and actually in the spread of Islamic traditions that I'll explain here. So their focus and emphasis was much more on introspection, almost looking inward in a way to learn truth. More of a mystical tradition in a way, however you want to kind of define that. So unlike a lot of some of the Muslims who, for studying religious truths, really focused it on the scripture in the Quran, they, again, took more of an inward approach towards doing that. So now where does it originate? Some people say it originated back with the early Umayyad Caliphate, so centuries before this, who became very profitable and rich, and some people maybe see that as a more mystical and spiritual response to kind of the luxury, or maybe almost like a response to the greed that was happening in the early caliphates there. So that might be possible there. Okay, another thing that Sufis are probably most important for when you look at history in general is that they made massive missionary efforts. Many of the Muslim missionaries were Sufis, and they played a very important role because they spread themselves, especially east, had a lot more success, and a lot of the success of Islam spreading into kind of Eastern and Southern Asia comes from the Sufis, and they were also ones that were far more able to adapt to local cultures and traditions. So when they would go to a place, again, not looking as much to the rigidity of what the Quran says in social structure, but took more of a introspective approach, which allowed them in a way to be more tolerant of the local traditions, and they were basically able to blend in better to other communities, which again also brought a lot of people to join Islam because when you looked at Sufi Islam, you saw something that you didn't have to reject all of your local customs. You could still have some of your local customs and traditions and also be a Muslim. So that is really where, from the historical perspective, where they are going to be very important to history. Okay, let's talk about commerce, class, and diversity. So Islamic society viewed merchants more prestigiously than Europe and Asia. In fact, in like in Asia, like in China, for example, under Confucianism, the merchant class is in some harsher terms, in certain times, was seen as like the parasite of the community because they revered more like education and scholarly type people. In Europe, you get a lot more money lending was very much like looked down upon by the church in Europe. So you see some of that. Now, the kind of embracing of merchant culture has deep roots, specifically because the Prophet Muhammad was from a merchant class. So the first Muslims were usually merchants. So that had created a very important part of Islamic social structure too, is the merchant class, because really everything comes through from that. Now, like I've mentioned a couple times here before as well, the Islamic empire, especially of the Middle East, grew rich from the Silk Road, right? The Silk Road was really revived under them and also expanded a lot too. The Islamic sailors were some of the best sailors in the world with their very advanced shipbuilding, which made the Indian Ocean access really kind of dominated by a lot of Islamic traders. So you get that going on, and then so you got the maritime sea routes that are thriving in this time period, as well as the overland, the traditional sort of Silk Road routes that were overland. So the Silk Road at this time is no longer really, I mean, the Silk Road was never like a physical road, like you can't really like walk it, you know what I mean? It's more of an idea about trade networks, but now that idea has spread so much more to not being land and being sea routes, right? Now, another thing that too is that a lot of merchants doubled as missionaries at this time. Sometimes missionaries might even come along with trade routes, but they kind of double. And one thing we learned about from topic 1.1 is trade is a perfect vehicle to spread religion, because you grow as merchants, you grow so close with those that buy from you and develop a personal relationship, and it's easy to believe that religion would be discussed too. So that is a way that it was there as well. So Islam spread through trade greatly as well. Just to make a connection, Buddhism spreading out of India basically did so because of trade as well. Okay. As far as diversity, now Islam spread very, very quick, right, in those early centuries, in and after Muhammad, and eventually became basically too diverse for any kind of cultural unity. Because when you think about it, there were so many cultural traditions among people that had adopted Islam. You've got, of course, the origination, right? It's by the Arab community, but then you get east into Central Asian cultures, and you're going to have Indian Muslims. Then going west, you're going to have like Egyptian Muslims. You're going to have North African Muslims. You're going to have Spanish Muslims, European Muslims. You know what I mean? And it eventually came to the point where really the only unifying factor of Muslims was Islam. So trying to unite them as like a singular empire is just not something that can happen. Now, one thing that's in a way kind of hurt, I guess, the uniformity of Islamic peoples was that the Arab Muslims early on very much viewed themselves as sort of the superior people of Islam because Muhammad was an Arab, the early Muslims were Arabic, so there was basically discrimination. And in the early Islamic empires, they, especially Umayyad Empire, the top positions in like military and government were Arab. And so it kind of became, if you were like a non-Arab Muslim, as you were ruled by foreigners. And when it comes down to it, it's like people generally don't want that in history. So it's like, all right, thank you for the religion, but if you're going to rule us and try to put some kind of social standing and some kind of hierarchy based on race, then there's not going to be as much unity. So you saw basically the caliphs that were trying to run the empire as an Arab dominated one became it broke apart, right? It didn't work. So the discrimination, though, does end up fading around the 9th century. So that first, through the 6th, 7th, and in the 800s, you saw this. Now, open persecution, though, wasn't necessarily like a massive thing, but there was definitely a level of discrimination that definitely ushered in the breakup of the idea of a singular Islamic empire. Now, some other things that was interesting to look at here is the caliph soldiers actually forbidden to own territory in the conquered lands. Military force would keep order, but for the most part, with the conquest especially, and we're mostly talking about after the 9th century, locals' lives remain largely unchanged. They remain largely unchanged. Okay. Now, another thing that people did, though, was pay tribute to the caliphs. All right. And a lot of them were doing that, especially if you were in a place that was like Northern Africa or in the Middle East, which before you paid tribute to the Byzantine rulers, you started to see that payment shifting towards the caliphs. Okay. Let's talk about slavery real quick. So slavery was a common practice throughout the Islamic world. Slavery was allowed, but there were some rules, especially at different times, about that. For example, usually did not enslave other Muslims. A couple other exemptions were Jews and Christians, as we're going to talk about a term later called the people of the book, the Abrahamic religions, which they did that. Which they were kind of named after, and then Zoroastrian. So you basically did not enslave, for the most part, kind of the locals. So where were slaves coming from? From three major reasons. One is from Africa, okay, like sub-Saharan Africa. And then also in Eastern Europe, which under this time might be considered the Kievan Rus. And then also from Central Asia. This is where this happens, okay? Now, another thing that was different, though, than some slavery that you saw in other places, some of the chattel slavery in a way, or what you might see in slavery, like the transatlantic slave later on, was there was not as much hereditary slavery, meaning that, like, children, for example, were considered free. So the children of a slave weren't automatically by default considered slaves. Okay. Now, many slaves, too, were adopted Islam, and one of the reasons a lot of slaves might convert to Islam, one, of course, is just being a part of Islamic community, but there are actually a lot of cases where if a slave converted to Islam, that might speed up when they actually become free. Some, I believe, were even basically like out of slavery, became free, almost instantly when they converted to Islam. So that's something to consider as well with slavery. But slavery will be a major, major institution in the Islamic world for centuries. A little bit more about slavery, specifically about women. So Slavery was especially used in agriculture, right? Although there's a big merchant class, there's also a very, very enormous agricultural class. So a lot of laborers doing that, being involved in that. But some, especially women, might serve other occupations as well. Slave women often served as concubines to Islamic men. Kind of interestingly about this, polygamy was quite common in Islamic cultures, and again, depending on where you lived, we're focusing more on the Middle East at the moment because the idea of wives and things like that, and amount of wives can change greatly depending on which Islamic community you're from. But like in the Middle East, for example, you had practice of polygamy that was quite common. Now, one of the rules sort of polygamy was that a woman or a man could have up to 4 wives, and what sometimes slave were then used by was were used basically as kind of like as a wife, but not officially a wife. They were a concubine because officially, like kind of on paper in a way, you just had four wives there. Now, also, some slave women were also allowed more independence. So, for example, some slave women actually had more independence than some of the free Islamic women, depending on the community there. So, for example, like allowed to go to the market potentially unattended, where sometimes women were allowed to do that without the accompaniment of a male family member. Also, some women that were potentially earning money were also using that as an opportunity to actually buy freedom as well. So that was something that did happen. Okay. So let's look at freed women. So we looked at slave women. Let's look at free women at this time. The treatment of women in the Islamic world varies greatly depending on where your region is. In fact, in a lot of cases, it's far more dependent on the local traditions than any actual doctrine, right, coming out of the Quran. So a lot of the customs, especially in Central Asia and the Middle East, and where the Byzantine Empire, where a lot of the traditions came actually even before Islam was even created, even before Muhammad. One of the examples is the veiling of the head and face, which you might see in Islamic culture, when that actually predates Muhammad. That actually goes back to ancient Mesopotamian culture, the hijab, or covering of the head and face. So sometimes that was adopted, but you'll see that the covering far more in a Middle Eastern place that used to be more tied to like Mesopotamia than when you will in like East Asia or Southeast Asia, where Islam was also was extremely popular there. So as far as Muhammad's policies went, actually raised the status of women as compared to a lot of the treatment of women in other places there. So like, let me give you a few examples of examples for this. So for example, insisting that dowries actually be paid to the future wife rather than kind of the father side, so actually going to the female side of things. Also, something that was unfortunately a thing that was happening in a lot of these cultures was infanticide, meaning the killing of infants, specifically female infanticide, which in many cultures happened because oftentimes families were looking at would rather have male children than female children because of the things that come out of that. So now also an example would be Muhammad's first wife, Khadija. She was educated and owned a business. She was from the business class as well. So you do have definitely origins with more educated and and in the business sphere for sure. Okay. But yeah, like I was talking about, the veiling actually goes way back before Muhammad, back to ancient Mesopotamia, and then was adopted. Usually, sometimes what people refer to this to now as the veiling as a kind of a sign of faith towards modesty, and that's what oftentimes is referred to today for the current hijab. Okay. A little more about status of women. Actually, comparatively so than Christian and Jewish communities, Islamic women enjoyed actually higher status than in those groups. A couple examples was the ability to inherit property, retain ownership after a marriage. So in a business culture, though, like that, that the Islamic world is really founded in, it probably becomes much more necessary to give women more rights to run the businesses, since trade again is so common. Some other things: allowed to remarry if you were widowed. Some places you don't have that in other cultures. In fact, too, if there was a divorce, could potentially receive a cash settlement and have at least some rights to go along with that. Now, the idea of divorce too has always been very different too, depending on what the culture is and what is required. Mostly speaking, in a lot of older cultures, it was basically male initiated. However, women, the wife, under certain circumstances, could actually initiate the divorce. Another thing some women were able to do was to practice birth control. In other cultures, that was more looked down upon. Another thing was in the courts. So you have what's called Sharia courts, which are basically Islamic courts. And women could testify there and be actually protected from retaliation. So they might be able to be physically more protected that way. However, what usually found that was the testimony of a woman in court was sometimes only seen as about half as valuable as a man's, as far as the record goes. Now, unfortunately, something we are missing greatly from the history of women's kind of relations in early Islam is the fact that very few women's perspective documents and evidence do we even have. Especially before about 1450, basically most all of records were written by men, so you don't actually see a lot of women's perspectives in writing. So that leads us to have a little bit hazier about how did women actually feel about their social status. We're basically completely committed to just the men's perspectives there. Okay, let's look a little bit more at kind of more outside of the Middle East here. Specifically, let's talk about Africa. So Islamic traders made their way to sub-Saharan Africa, both west, south, sort of south across the Sahara Desert, as Muslims were trying to break into the products coming out of sub-Saharan Africa, specifically with gold and salt. And so you saw Islam spread into those kingdoms. Eventually, those will be like kingdoms of Mali and other ones there. And you have it on the East Coast, right? So Islamic traders were very interested in going on the East Coast of Africa because port cities and trying to have the ocean trade over there with India and Southeast Asia, which was incredibly profitable there. So what you actually saw, too, was a lot of cultural blending, especially in East Africa. In fact, the Bantu peoples, which are really the major group in East Africa, they have their own languages, the Bantu languages. When Muslims from the north came and moved down south, they actually ended up blending into basically a new language, which is the Swahili language, which is a very widely spoken language today. So you see those blendings happening there. Okay, let's go over to Spain. So we looked kind of down south in that way. Now let's look a little bit west. So in Spain, the Umayyads, the kind of the earliest of the Islamic empires, had more success west of the Middle East than actually later on the Abbasids did. And there were a few feats. So it spread very quickly among northern Africa. A lot of that because there wasn't nearly as much population density. But Muslim forces ended up basically kicking out the Byzantines in about 711. So pretty early on in the Islamic world, the Byzantines were basically kicked out. They then went further west, basically taking control over basically all of northern Africa, and then crossing kind of the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain, where then they are going to start interacting with Christians. And eventually they take over Spain and set up basically a capital in Cordoba, which is going to become like kind of the Islamic capital, really, of the Spanish Islamic capital. And as we discussed earlier, was also an intellectual center, right? Okay, a little more about Spain. where the after conquering basically most of Spain, the Islamic forces attempted to go more into Western Europe, specifically in today what would be like modern day France. Now they were eventually turned back, and their conquests in Europe here stopped with their loss at the Battle of Tours, which will be a topic for another time too, when we eventually get to Western Europe here, and. But yes, the Battle of Tours are a very rare defeat actually for Islamic armies who had basically been unstoppable throughout the 700s. But this did again, the Battle of Tours marked the end of expansion into Western Europe, basically now continuing to solidify Christianity as the dominant religion in Western Europe. Had Battle of Tours maybe gone differently, could be talking about a different story. So it is definitely a pivotal kind of moment, right, where this could change history drastically. Now, Muslims will basically stay and will rule, though Spain they will hold on to and rule all the way through another 7 centuries until Ferdinand and Isabella in the 1490s officially drive out the Spaniards out of the remaining part of Spain. Okay. Prosperity. So in Spain, and Al-Andalus as it was often called, kind of Spanish Muslim Spain, there was actually quite a bit of tolerance towards Muslims, Christians, and Jews. This also promoted a lot of interaction, between them intellectually, especially at these universities. And so you had this tolerance, again, between the 3 major groups. And again, they were considered, the Muslims, Christians, and Jews, the people of the book, or people that had their origins and kind of their religious origins through Abraham, which all 3 religions believe they tie in sort of an ancestry through, right? And believing some of those similar things and observing those prophets. So the other thing that they encouraged too is they promoted trade through China and Southeast Asia. So you actually saw Chinese and Southeast Asia goods come all the way into Spain, basically the farthest possible distance from East Asia, Southeast Asia, making its way all the way into Spain there. And in fact, some of their boats and things like that were influenced by India and China. So technology, right, was also coming from east to west. Okay, a little bit more cultural and scholarly transfers happening here. Ibn Rushd was a very influential one coming out of Spain as a kind of a Spanish Muslim in this territory. Wrote influential works on law, secular philosophy, natural sciences. He's going to be widely read by Europeans later on. Very influential to that. So, like I was saying before, the idea of Muslims, Christians, and Jews were known as people of the book, going back to kind of having the similar kind of literary tradition and foundations there. And like I've also been saying, Islamic scholarship and the scientific innovations really helped basically lay the groundwork for the European Renaissance and the scientific revolution, which are going to follow here shortly. A lot of what was happening here in Europe was rediscovering a lot of these ancient texts of basically some of their own peoples, like Roman and Greek texts, that were kind of being rediscovered. And like we said at the very beginning of the lesson today, those things were preserved by Islamic and preserved and continually studied by Islamic scholars. Okay, with that, we are wrapping up today. So just to mention a couple things, the historical developments laid out that are very important, laid out by AP and AP World History Modern Curriculum. Some of the things that we had talked about, which are just kind of big picture ideas, things that are going on you need to know. And hopefully now that we've studied a little bit, we can see and hopefully provide some examples for these historical developments. So the ones that were covered, at least in part here in this lesson, was Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and the core beliefs and practices of these religions continue to shape the societies of Africa and Asia, for sure. And then other historical development, as the Abbasid Caliphate fragments, new Islamic political entities will emerge, most of which were dominated by Turkic peoples, which we talked about. For example, the Seljuk Turks. And these states demonstrated continuity as well as diversity, meaning there's a lot of things that were continuing from earlier times, but also a lot of diversity and differences amongst the groups. Okay, a couple more. Big picture again, historical developments happening here in this topic. Muslim rule extended to expand to many parts of Afro-Eurasia due to multiple reasons. One being military expansion, and also the activities of merchants and missionaries, specifically through the Sufis, who were, again, very well known for their missionary efforts. And then Muslim states and empires, they encouraged significant intellectual innovations as well as transfers, as being sort of the middlemen of Eurasia. Everything basically traveled through them. All the achievements, all the knowledge, technologies, whatever, it kind of went through them. And they ushered that on rather than blocking that. All right, then. With that today, that is going to wrap up our lesson, topic 1.2, okay, developments in Dar es-Salaam in between generally the periods 1200 to 1450. As we're wrapping up here, I want to thank anybody that was watching live. Thank you for being a part of the audience today. Looks like we have possible donations. Let's go ahead and see what's going on here. All right, we had a super chat come in from, let's see, from Sam Murray. Sam Murray, one of my locals at my school and soccer player extraordinaire. Up. Again, other ways to, there are multiple ways to support this channel. The donations have been great ever since this channel started, and there are multiple ways to do that. Sam Murray said, ready for soccer season. Also, how's Frankie? If you have followed my channel, Frankie is my dog who sometimes appears and makes noises. He's doing well. Soccer season, of course. Love soccer. Hope to do big things this upcoming year for sure. So thank you to Sam for your donation. Other ways you can support the stream during these lessons. If you have a question or anything that would like to be read, best way to do that is through the super chat function, which gets highlighted so that I can see that. Other ways to contribute: you can join the Patreon, which links are in the description. That you'll be able to see that, as well as through Streamlabs as well. Different ways that you can support the stream. The content and the lessons will be free, and donations, pledges are extremely appreciated. But never feel like you have to, only if you, of course, want to. Okay, I think that will then go ahead and wrap up today. A couple other invitations out there if you would like to join a historical community. There is a Discord server that you may join. Anyone may join. There'll be a link to that in the description below, and hope to see you over there as well. Okay, with that, I think that is going to end it here. I think that is it for donations and support coming through there. Okay. All right, thank you to everyone that pledged through Patreon today. Saw some names and things pop up there. There are some other benefits to being a supporter, specifically with Patreon. If you are a Patreon pledger, you get to participate in a weekly poll for reaction videos. There will be videos, possible videos to select from there, and at least about once a week, I will choose the one that is leading in the poll. And so that is one thing for all pledgers, regardless of donation level and tier level. But again, thank you for donations through Streamlabs, through the Super Chats, and through the Patreon today. Stay tuned for future lessons. Topic 1.3 will be coming up, which is on South Asia. So that will be kind of a focus on India specifically. That'll be coming up in for topic 1.3. All right, with that, we've just passed the hour mark, which is always a good time, I believe, to try to stay focused on. So I think we're going to go ahead and end it here. Thank you to everyone that has shown up again. Hope to see you around soon for a future lesson, and we'll go ahead and call it here. All right, thanks again. Have a good day.